My name is Alex, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a geological surveyor. It's a job that takes me to the forgotten corners of the country, to places most people only see on maps, if they see them at all. Our task is simple: assess the stability and mineral composition of old, defunct sites for potential reclamation or permanent sealing. Last fall, my partner, Ben, and I were assigned to the Ironwood Creek mine, a sprawling labyrinth of tunnels burrowed deep into the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. The nearest town, a place called Tamarack, was little more than a wide spot in the road with a gas station, a diner, and a handful of houses. The people there were nice enough, in a reserved, keep-to-yourself kind of way. They had a deep-seated respect for the mountains that surrounded them, a respect that bordered on fear. On our first evening, while stocking up on supplies, the old man behind the counter, a fellow named Jedediah, eyed the logos on our jackets. He knew where we were headed. You could see it in the way his friendly demeanor tightened just a little. He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You boys be careful up at Ironwood," he'd said, his gaze flicking towards the darkening peaks outside his window. "And remember the old rule up there: never answer a voice that calls from the dark." I offered a polite smile, assuming it was just some local folklore, a ghost story to spook outsiders. "Every remote town has one." Ben chuckled beside me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, Jed," he said. "We're not planning on talking to anyone down there." The old man didn't smile back. He just gave us a slow, deliberate nod and went back to bagging our groceries. The warning, however, stuck in my mind, a strange and unsettling seed planted before we even set foot on the mountain. The drive up to the mine the next morning was a testament to its isolation. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track that was slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The air grew thin and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The mine entrance was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, a dark, foreboding opening framed by rotting timbers and stained with decades of mineral runoff. It looked like a wound in the ancient rock, one that had never properly healed. Our work was methodical, almost mind-numbing at times. We'd start at the entrance and work our way in, using laser scanners and seismic equipment to map the tunnels. We checked for structural weaknesses, took core samples, and documented every passage, every shaft, every dead end. The first few days were entirely normal. The mine was quiet, save for the drip of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, and the echo of our own voices and footsteps. It was a cold, silent world, bathed in the sterile white light of our headlamps. The darkness beyond our beams was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in on you. It swallowed sound, making you feel profoundly alone even when standing right next to someone. Ben and I had worked together for years and had a comfortable rhythm. We'd communicate with hand signals and brief, clipped sentences, our voices sounding small and insignificant in the vast subterranean space. But even in those first few days, there was something off about Ironwood Creek. It was a feeling more than anything else, a sense of being watched, a static in the air that raised the hairs on your arms. Sometimes I'd pause what I was doing, certain I had heard something just at the edge of my hearing. A faint scraping sound, a distant rumble that wasn't an earth tremor. But whenever I'd ask Ben if he heard it, he'd just shake his head, giving me a look that said I was letting the spooky atmosphere get to me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the data, on the precise measurements and the geological charts. This was a job, after all, a scientific endeavor, but the feeling lingered. The mine felt old, ancient even, in a way that had nothing to do with when it was excavated. It felt like we were intruders in a place that had its own secrets, its own quiet history that had long since been forgotten by the world above. We set up a small base camp a few hundred yards from the entrance, with a sturdy tent, a generator, and our communication equipment. The nights were just as unsettling as the days spent underground. The mountain was never truly silent. The wind whispered through the pines, and the sounds of the forest were a constant chorus of clicks, rustles, and occasional howls. But sometimes, lying in my sleeping bag, I'd hear a noise that didn't fit, a sound that seemed to come from the direction of the mine itself. A low, resonant hum, almost too deep to be audible, that vibrated through the ground. Ben never mentioned hearing it, and I didn't press the issue. I didn't want him to think I was losing my nerve. We had a job to do, a long and potentially dangerous one. The last thing we needed was to start spooking each other with ghost stories. So I kept my unease to myself, attributing it to fatigue and the inherent creepiness of the location. I told myself that Jedediah's warning had gotten under my skin, that my imagination was simply running wild in the oppressive dark. But deep down, a part of me wasn't convinced. A part of me felt like we were on the edge of something terrible, and that every step we took deeper into the Ironwood Creek mine was a step closer to a truth we were not meant to find. The first incident happened on our fourth day. It was subtle, so subtle that I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. We were deep in a mine, maybe a mile in, working our way down a secondary tunnel designated Sector Gamma on the old schematics. It was a narrow, claustrophobic passage, the walls slick with moisture and glistening in the beams of our headlamps. Our task was to scan the rock strata for signs of quartz intrusion, a tedious but necessary part of the survey. The only sounds were the familiar ones, the soft whir of my scanner, the crunch of our boots on the gravelly floor, and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water seeping through the rock ceiling. Ben was about 20 feet ahead of me, taking core samples with a hand drill. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant like old blood. I was focused on the scanner's display, watching the digital lines build a 3D model of the surrounding rock. It was hypnotic, almost meditative work. And then I heard it. It was faint, incredibly faint, like a whisper carried on a phantom breeze. It was a voice, a human voice. I froze, my hand tightening on the scanner. It was just a single word, distorted by distance and the acoustics of the tunnel. I couldn't make out what it was, but the intonation was clear. It sounded like a question. It sounded like it was calling out. My first thought was that it was Ben. I lifted my head, my headlamp beam cutting a sharp white line through the darkness towards him. Ben, you say something? My voice sounded loud, intrusive in the silence. He stopped drilling and turned to look at me, his face partially obscured by the glare of his own lamp. Negative, he said, his voice echoing slightly. Wasn't me. What? A cold knot formed in my stomach. I thought I heard something, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Sounded like someone talking. Ben was quiet for a moment. He swept his headlamp beam down the tunnel, past me, and then back towards the darkness behind him. The light illuminated nothing but endless, damp rock. Probably just the wind, he said, his voice lacking conviction. This place is full of drafts. Plays tricks on your ears. I knew he was right, or at least I wanted him to be. Mines are notorious for strange acoustics. Air currents moving through narrow fissures can create sounds that mimic voices, whistles, even screams. It's a well-documented phenomenon. It was the logical, rational explanation, but it didn't feel logical. The sound hadn't been like the wind. It had the distinct cadence of a human voice. It felt personal, directed. I stood there, listening, straining to hear it again. But there was nothing, only the dripping water and the low hum of our equipment. You good? Ben asked, his voice cutting through my thoughts. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied. Just a little jumpy, I guess. He grunted in understanding and turned back to his work. The screech of the drill started up again, filling the narrow passage with its grating noise. I tried to focus back on my scanner, but my concentration was shattered. My eyes kept darting into the oppressive darkness that surrounded our small bubble of light. Every shadow seemed to move, to writhe at the edge of my vision. The rest of the day was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling of being listened to. The silence between the noises of our work felt heavier, charged with an unspoken presence. I replayed the sound in my head over and over again. It wasn't just that I'd heard a voice, it was the feeling that came with it. It was a lonely sound, a desolate sound. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they've been calling out for a very, very long time. That evening, back at camp, the feeling of unease followed me out of the mine. I sat by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee, and stared up at the black mouth of the tunnel. It seemed to watch us, a silent, patient observer. Ben was on the satellite phone, leaving a message for a supervisor, a routine daily check-in. His voice was calm, professional, detailing our progress and the geological data we'd collected. He didn't mention what I'd heard. I was glad he didn't. Saying it out loud would have made it more real. As long as it was just something I'd heard, I could dismiss it. I could blame it on the wind, on fatigue, on my imagination. But I couldn't forget the old man's warning. Never answer a voice that calls from the dark. Had the voice been calling for me? Was it a question, waiting for a response? The thought sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. I told myself it was ridiculous. It was a mine, a hole in the ground. Nothing more. But as I tried to fall asleep that night, the memory of that faint, questioning voice echoed in the darkness behind my closed eyes, and for the first time on the job, I felt a genuine, primal fear of going back into the earth the next day. I felt like we had disturbed something, woken something up from a long and silent slumber, and I had a terrible feeling that it now knew we were there. The days that followed were a slow, grinding descent into a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. The voice I had heard in Sector Gamma did not return immediately, but its absence was almost as unsettling as its presence had been. It left a void, a question mark hanging in the deep, subterranean silence. Every time a rock skittered down a distant shaft or the wind moaned through a fissure, my head would snap up, my heart pounding, expecting to hear it again. Ben seemed to have forgotten the incident entirely, or at least he was doing a good job of pretending to. He was a rock, always focused on the task at hand. His pragmatism was usually a comfort, but now it felt like a wall I couldn't penetrate. I wanted to talk about it, to dissect it, to have him tell me I was crazy. But I held back, not wanting to be the guy who cracks under pressure. So we worked, the unspoken tension stretching between us like a thin, fraying wire. The second incident occurred about a week after the first. We had moved our survey to a deeper level of the mine, a section that had been closed off since the 1950s according to our maps. The air here was different, stale, heavy, and carrying a strange, almost chemical smell, like ozone after a lightning strike. The tunnels were shored up with massive, petrified timbers that were slick with a pale, phosphorescent fungus that cast a ghostly, greenish light. We were setting up a seismic resonator, a device that sends vibrations through the rock to map its density. It was a two-man job. I was calibrating the machine, while Ben was about 50 yards down the tunnel, planting the last of the geosensors. We were communicating via our short-range radios, clipped to our vests. Sensor 4 is in place. Ben's voice crackled through my earpiece. Ready for calibration sequence on your mark. Copy that. I replied, my fingers tapping on the keypad of the resonator. Give me 2 minutes. As I worked, I heard a sound over the radio's open channel. It wasn't Ben. It was a soft, rhythmic whispering. It was too faint to make out any words, just the sibilant, hissing sound of a human voice speaking in hushed tones. My blood ran cold. Ben, you hearing this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper itself. The whispering stopped. A moment of static, and then Ben's voice came back, tight and strained. Yeah, I hear it. What the hell is that? It wasn't just me this time. He heard it too. A wave of validation and terror washed over me simultaneously. I wasn't imagining things. This was real. I don't know, I said, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The tunnel was empty. It's coming through the radio. Is your mic keyed? Negative, he replied, his breathing now audible over the comms. It's not coming from my end. It sounds like it's on the channel. The whispering started again, a little louder this time. It was a cascade of soft, sibilant sounds, overlapping and weaving together. It wasn't one voice. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once, a chilling chorus from nowhere. We stood there, frozen, listening to this impossible broadcast from the heart of the mountain. It was as if someone or something had tapped into our frequency. Then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The channel was filled with nothing but the gentle hiss of static. "Alex? You there?" Ben's voice was shaky. "I'm here," I managed to say, my own voice trembling. "It's gone." "What was that?" he asked, the question hanging in the dead air. "Signal interference? Someone else on our frequency. Out here? This deep?" I countered. "Our radios are low power, short range. There's no one for miles. And even if there were, there's 1,000 feet of solid rock between us and the surface." He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. We finished the calibration sequence in near total silence, the professional rhythm of our work feeling like a flimsy shield against a dread that was becoming more and more tangible. The environmental obstacles started the next day, as if the mountain itself was trying to keep us there. A storm rolled in from the north, a massive, unseasonable blizzard that buried the landscape in 3 feet of snow in less than 12 hours. The dirt track we used to get up the mountain was completely impassable. We were stranded. Our satellite phone, our only link to the outside world, went dead. The display just read, "Searching for signal," the message a bleak confirmation of our isolation. The generator for our base camp sputtered and died on the second day of the storm, the fuel line having frozen solid. We were thrown back into a primitive existence, reliant on battery-powered lanterns and the dwindling supply of firewood we had gathered. The cold was relentless. It seeped into our tent, into our bones. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the psychological pressure. Being trapped made the mind feel less like a workplace and more like a prison. And every night, the storm would howl outside, the wind shrieking through the pines like 1,000 tormented voices, and I would lie awake, listening, wondering if the sounds from the mine would start again. They did, but not in the way I expected. Tools began to go missing. One morning, a specialized wrench that Ben had been using was gone from his belt. We searched the entire section of the tunnel we were in, a place we hadn't left for hours. It was nowhere. We were forced to backtrack 2 levels to get a spare from our main cache. Later that day, we found the missing wrench. It was sitting on a rock in the middle of a passage we had cleared not an hour before, placed neatly, almost deliberately, as if on display. Another time, my seismic scanner, a piece of equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars, vanished from the spot where I'd set it down. We were in a dead-end tunnel. There was nowhere for it to go. Ben and I were the only 2 people there. We searched for over an hour, a frantic, desperate hunt in the oppressive dark. We eventually gave up, the loss a major blow to our survey. The next day, we found it back at our base camp, tucked inside my sleeping bag, cold and damp. The cold spots started a few days later. They were distinct, localized pockets of frigid air in the deepest parts of the mine. You'd be walking down a tunnel, the temperature a steady 45 degrees, and then you'd step into an area where the air was suddenly, shockingly cold, like walking into a meat locker. Your breath would fog, and goosebumps would erupt on your arms. The temperature gauge on my multi-tool would drop 20 or 30 degrees in the space of a few feet. Then a few steps later, it would be back to normal. There was no draft, no source of the cold. It was just there, a patch of unnatural, predatory chill in the darkness. Each incident, on its own, could almost be explained away. Misplaced tools, strange atmospheric conditions, faulty equipment. But together, they formed a pattern, a clear and terrifying escalation. Something was toying with us. Something intelligent. It was moving our things, creating impossible phenomena, letting us know, in no uncertain terms, that we were not welcome. The breaking point came during the second week of being snowed in. We were low on food, low on fuel for the camp stove, and our nerves were frayed to the breaking point. We had decided to explore a promising-looking side tunnel that wasn't on any of the maps we had. It was a risk, but our primary survey was stalled without a functioning scanner, and we were getting desperate for a discovery to justify our extended time here. The tunnel was old, clearly from the earliest days of the mine. The walls were rough-hewn, scarred with the pickaxe marks of men long dead. It sloped steeply downwards, and the air grew colder and denser with every step. After about 500 feet, the tunnel opened into a large, cavernous chamber, the ceiling lost in the darkness above our headlamp beams. In the center of the chamber was a deep, circular shaft, a vertical well dropping down into God knows what. There was no barrier around it, just a black, gaping hole in the rock floor. We approached it cautiously, shining our lights down into its depths. The beams were swallowed by the darkness. It was impossible to tell how deep it went. As we stood at the edge, a sound drifted up from the shaft. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a voice, as clear as if the person were standing right next to us. It was a man's voice, calm and conversational. "Did you bring the fuses?" it asked. Ben and I froze, our blood turning to ice. We looked at each other, our faces pale in the glow of our lamps. There was no mistaking it. It was a clear, direct question. It sounded so normal, so mundane, that it was utterly, terrifyingly out of place in this dead, forgotten corner of the earth. I remembered Jedediah's words then, flashing in my mind like a neon sign. Never answer a voice that calls from the dark. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, profound silence. The voice had come from the shaft, from the infinite blackness below our feet. Ben, however, seemed to be in shock. He took a half step forward, peering down into the shaft. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to answer. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. A terrible, gut-wrenching mistake. The moment the words left his lips, the silence that followed was broken. From the depths of the shaft, a sound erupted. It wasn't a voice. It was a shriek. A long, drawn-out, multifaceted shriek that was made of a dozen different voices, all screaming in unison. It was a sound of pure agony and rage, and it echoed through the chamber, vibrating in our chests, in our teeth. We scrambled backwards away from the edge, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The shriek went on, a sound that didn't belong to this world. As it finally began to fade, another sound replaced it. A scraping, dragging noise from deep within the shaft. Something was coming up. That was it. That was the moment the game ended. This was no longer about strange noises or misplaced tools. We turned and we ran. We fled back up the sloping tunnel, not daring to look back, the horrifying shriek still ringing in our ears. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the mine entrance into the blinding white of the snow-covered landscape. We stood there, gasping for air, our bodies trembling uncontrollably, looking back at the dark maw of the mine. We had broken the rule, and we had awakened something terrible. The hours after we fled the mine were a blur of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror. We didn't stop at our camp. We just kept going, stumbling and sliding through the deep snow, driven by a primal need to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that horrifying sound. The shriek from the shaft had shattered our last vestiges of denial. There was something in that mine, something old and malevolent, and it knew we were there. We finally collapsed from exhaustion about a half-mile away, in a thicket of snow-laden pines that offered some meager shelter from the biting wind. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that felt like a cruel mockery of the ugliness we had just experienced. We didn't speak for a long time, the only sounds our own ragged breaths and the frantic beating of our hearts. "What was that, Alex?" Ben finally whispered, his voice hoarse. He was staring back towards a mountain, his face a pale, haunted mask. What in God's name was that? I had no answer. I just shook my head, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality of it. The clear, conversational voice asking about fuses. The chorus of screams. The sound of something ascending from the depths. It didn't fit into any logical framework. It was the stuff of nightmares made real. We knew we couldn't stay out in the open. The temperature was dropping fast, and we were soaked with sweat and snow. We had to go back to the camp for shelter, for supplies. The thought of sleeping so close to that mine entrance was terrifying, but freezing to death was a more immediate threat. We made our way back, moving cautiously, every snap of a twig or gust of wind sending a fresh jolt of fear through us. The camp was as we had left it, silent and still under a blanket of fresh snow. But the atmosphere had changed. The familiar clearing no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt exposed, vulnerable. The dark opening of the mine loomed over us, a black hole of dread that seemed to suck all the light and warmth from the air. That night was the longest of my life. Neither of us slept. We sat huddled in the tent, a single battery-powered lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the canvas walls. We had a hunting rifle with us, a standard part of our kit for bear protection. Ben kept it across his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the stock. It felt like a pathetic, useless talisman against whatever was dwelling in the mountain. Around midnight, the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a low, rhythmic booming coming from deep within the earth directly beneath us. Boom, boom, boom. It was slow and deliberate, like the footsteps of something immense. With each impact, the ground would tremble, and a fine dusting of snow would shake loose from the trees outside. We looked at each other in the dim light of the lantern, our eyes wide with terror. This was new. This was different. The phenomena had always been confined to the mine itself. Now it was outside. It felt like the mountain itself was stirring, waking from a long slumber. The booming continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, patient, and impossibly heavy tread that seemed to be searching, pacing back and forth in the rock beneath our feet. Then the voices started, not from a radio, not from a deep shaft, but from the woods around us. They came from all directions at once, whispering from behind the trees, from the snowbanks, from the dark sky above. They were the same sibilant, overlapping whispers we had heard on the radio, but now they were in the open air, carried on the freezing wind. They circled our camp, a vortex of unintelligible, menacing sound. Ben started to unravel. "They're out there," he hissed, his eyes darting around wildly. "They're all around us." "Stay calm," I said, my own voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words. "It's the wind. It's just the wind in the trees." But I knew it was a lie. The wind didn't whisper your name. And that's what happened next. Amidst the chorus of incoherent whispering, a single voice detached itself from the cacophony. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, and it spoke my name. "Alex," it whispered, seeming to come from just outside the tent flap. "Let me in. It's cold out here." My breath hitched in my throat. It was a trick. It had to be. A cruel, psychological game. But the voice was so convincing, so full of pleading vulnerability. For a split second, an insane, irrational part of me wanted to open the tent to help whoever was out there. Then I remembered Jedediah's warning, the one Ben had so disastrously broken. Never answer a voice that calls from the dark. It wasn't just about speaking to them. It was about acknowledging them, engaging with them in any way. "Don't listen," I whispered to Ben, grabbing his arm. "It's not real." The voice came again, closer this time, a breathy whisper right against the canvas. "I know you're in there, Alex. I can see your light." Suddenly, Ben snapped. He lurched to his feet, raising the rifle. "Leave us alone," he screamed into the darkness. "Get away from us." The moment he shouted, the whispers stopped. A dead, heavy silence fell over the camp. The booming under the ground ceased. For a moment, I hoped that he had scared it off. Then the ground heaved. It wasn't a tremor. It was a single, violent lurch, as if something colossal had thrown its weight against the bedrock beneath us. The lantern fell over, plunging the tent into darkness. We were thrown to the floor. From outside came a deafening crack, the sound of a massive tree trunk splitting in two. Panic took over. We scrambled for the tent zipper, fumbling in the pitch black. We burst out into the frigid night air. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but the snow cast a faint, ethereal glow over the scene. And what we saw made my mind recoil. One of the massive pine trees that bordered our clearing, a tree that must have been 100 feet tall and 5 feet thick at its base, was falling. It was falling directly towards our tent. But it wasn't falling naturally. It had been pushed. There was no sound of a chainsaw, no sign of rot. The base of the trunk was shattered, splintered outwards as if from a massive, impossible impact from the direction of the mine. We ran. We didn't have time to think. We just turned and sprinted into the woods as the giant tree came crashing down with a sound like the end of the world, obliterating the spot where we had been just seconds before. Snow and splintered wood exploded into the air. We kept running, blindly, tripping over roots and fallen branches, the sounds of the whispers starting up again behind us, this time laced with something that sounded like laughter. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. We finally took refuge in a shallow rock alcove, huddling together for warmth, listening as the chorus of disembodied voices continued to mock us from the surrounding darkness. The physical danger, the sheer, impossible power we had just witnessed, had stripped away any last hope that we were dealing with something explainable. This wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a force of nature, a geological scale entity that could shatter ancient trees like twigs. We had trespassed into its home, and now it was hunting us. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. We were unarmed, exposed, and miles from any semblance of safety. The whispers eventually faded with the first hint of dawn, leaving behind a silence that was just as terrifying. As the weak morning light filtered through the trees, we knew we had to make a choice. We could try to wait for the snow to clear, a process that could take weeks, or we could risk going back into the mine. It sounded insane, but it was a calculated risk. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to be tied to the mountain, but its most direct and terrifying manifestations had been inside the tunnels. Outside, it could topple trees, its power seemingly limitless. Inside, it played with sound with our minds. Maybe, just maybe, we could navigate the labyrinth we had spent weeks mapping and find another way out, an old ventilation shaft or an access tunnel on the other side of the ridge. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than freezing to death while being toyed with by an ancient, malevolent intelligence. With a shared look of grim resolve, we made our decision. We would go back into the darkness. We would face the voices one last time, on their own turf, in a desperate bid for survival. We started the long, cautious trek back towards the gaping maw of the Ironwood Creek mine. The final descent began not with a choice, but with the mountain making one for us. As we cautiously re-entered the mine, the silence was absolute. The whispers were gone. The underground booming had ceased. There was only the drip of water and the sound of our own ragged breathing. It was a predatory silence, the kind that comes before a strike. We moved quickly, our headlamps cutting frantic paths through the familiar tunnels, heading for a ventilation shaft marked on a schematic from the 1920s. It was our only hope for a way out that didn't involve passing the main shaft where we had made our fatal mistake that we were about 1.5 miles deep, navigating a narrow passage when the rumbling started. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic booming from before. This was a high-frequency vibration that hummed through the soles of our boots, growing in intensity with every second. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Small pebbles began to skitter down the rock walls. "Cave in!" Ben yelled, his voice tight with panic. There was no time to run back. The entire passage was shaking violently. Ahead of us, a small fissure in the rock wall, one we had noted but ignored, was widening with an audible cracking sound. It was our only chance. "In here!" I screamed, shoving Ben towards the opening. We squeezed through the crack in the rock just as the tunnel behind us collapsed with a deafening roar, a tidal wave of rock and earth that filled the space where we had just been standing. The world went black. The roar was absolute, a physical force that battered us, stealing the air from our lungs. We were thrown forward by the concussion, landing in a heap in a space no bigger than a closet. The noise subsided, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. We were trapped. The way back was gone, buried under tons of rock. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I clicked it on. Ben did the same. We were in a small, natural cavern, a pocket in the rock that the cave-in had, by some miracle, left intact. But our relief was short-lived. This space wasn't on any of our maps. We were cut off, buried alive in an unknown part of the mine. And we were not alone. The whispers started again, not from one direction, but from all around us, seeming to emanate from the very rock itself. They were louder now, clearer. We could almost make out words, fragments of sentences and languages we didn't recognize, interspersed with that same calm, English-speaking voice we'd heard from the shaft. "The fuses," it said, the voice right beside my ear. "You didn't bring them." "We're going to die here," Ben muttered, rocking back and forth, his face a mask of despair. "No," I said, grabbing his shoulder, forcing him to look at me. "No, we're not. There's another way out. There has to be." Our headlamp beams revealed a narrow tunnel leading away from the small cavern, sloping steeply downwards. It was our only option. We pushed forward, deeper into the unknown, the chorus of whispers following us like a funeral dirge. The air grew colder, and the strange, metallic smell of ozone was so strong it made our eyes water. The tunnel opened into a vast, cathedral-like cavern, far larger than any we had seen before. And the source of the whispering was immediately apparent. The walls of the cavern were not solid rock. They were a lattice of thick, dark, crystalline veins that pulsed with a faint, internal, sickly green light. And embedded within these veins, like insects trapped in amber, were figures. They were humanoid in shape, but horrifically distorted. Their limbs were elongated, their bodies twisted into impossible angles. Their faces were frozen in silent screams, mouths agape, eyes wide with a terror that had been fossilized over eons. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all trapped within the glowing, crystalline prison of the cavern walls. They were miners, from the look of their tattered, old-fashioned clothing. They were the source of the whispers, their psychic agony echoing through the rock for a century. As we stared in horror, the calm voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a booming, resonant sound that came from the center of the cavern, a voice that seemed to hold the weight of the entire mountain. "You have seen what is not yours to see." Our headlamp beams swung towards the source of the voice. In the center of the cavern, a massive, crystalline formation rose from the floor, glowing more brightly than the rest. And in front of it, a shape began to coalesce from the shadows. It wasn't one of the trapped miners. It was something else entirely. It was tall and spindly, its form shifting and indistinct, as if it were woven from pure shadow and geothermal heat. It had no face, no discernible features, just a vaguely man-shaped silhouette of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light from our lamps. It moved with a slow, disjointed gait, like a marionette with its strings cut, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. This was the master of this place, the shepherd of this chorus of damned souls. "You broke the silence," the voice boomed, emanating from the featureless shape. "You answer the call, and now you will join the choir." The trapped figures in the walls began to writhe. Their silent screams became audible, a terrible, unified wail of agony that filled the cavern. The green light in the crystalline veins flared, and the very rock around us began to hum with a malevolent energy. Ben finally broke. He raised the rifle he had somehow managed to hold on to and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash a brilliant, momentary star. The bullet ricocheted off the crystalline wall with a high-pitched whine. The shadowy figure didn't even flinch. It raised one of its long, spindly arms, and a section of the cavern wall near Ben exploded inwards. Not with the force of a cave-in, but with a terrifying precision. A shower of razor-sharp crystal shards erupted from the wall, a shotgun blast of geological shrapnel. I screamed Ben's name, but it was too late. He was thrown back like a rag doll, his body riddled with the glowing green fragments. He hit the ground and didn't move. I was alone. Pure animal terror took over. I turned and ran, scrambling back the way I came, away from the wailing walls and the shadowy horror. The booming voice laughed behind me, a sound that shook the very foundations of my sanity. "You cannot run from the rock," it echoed. "You are already a part of it." I scrambled back into the narrow tunnel, expecting to be crushed at any moment. But it didn't come. I could hear it behind me, a slow, scraping sound, the sound of something dragging itself along the stone floor. It wasn't rushing. It knew it didn't have to. I reached the small cavern where the cave-in had trapped us. There was nowhere to go. The main tunnel was blocked by a mountain of rubble. It was a dead end. This was it. This was where I would die, my own screaming face to be forever preserved in a glowing green tomb. I collapsed against the wall of rubble, my headlamp beam shaking wildly, pointing at the tunnel entrance. I waited for the shadow to appear. I waited for the end, and then I felt it. A draft, a small but steady stream of cold, fresh air coming from above me. I looked up. High on the wall of rubble, nestled among the massive boulders, was a small, dark opening. A crack. It was maybe 2 feet wide. It was my only chance. With the last of my strength, I began to climb. I clawed my way up the unstable pile of rocks, sending cascades of smaller stones tumbling down behind me. The scraping sound from the tunnel was getting closer, accompanied by the low, mocking whispers. I pulled myself up, squeezing my body through the narrow opening, scraping my skin raw on the sharp edges of the rock. I fell through the other side, landing hard on a downward sloping surface of loose scree. I had found it. The ventilation shaft. It was a near vertical climb, but there were old, rusted iron rungs set into the rock. Without a second thought, I began to ascend, pulling myself up rung by rung, my muscles screaming in protest. Below me, from the hole I had just crawled through, the whispering intensified, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. I didn't look down. I just climbed, driven by a singular, desperate need to see the sky again. I don't know how long I climbed. It could have been minutes or hours. My world narrowed to the next rung, the next breath, the next upward pull. The air grew fresher, colder. And then I saw it. A faint circle of gray light far above me. The surface. I emerged from the earth like a creature being born, crawling out of a narrow, forgotten hole in the side of the mountain, miles from our original campsite. I lay on the snow, gasping, my body a wreck of cuts, bruises, and sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion. I had made it. I was alive. The snow had stopped, and a weak, watery sun was trying to break through the clouds. The world was silent, peaceful. The contrast to the hell I had just escaped was so profound it felt unreal. I looked back at the small, dark hole I had crawled out of, half expecting to see a shadowy arm reach out after me. But there was nothing, just the silence of the mountain. It took me 2 days to walk out. I had no food, no water save for melted snow. I was running on pure adrenaline and the ghost of Ben's memory. Every step was agony. Every shadow in the woods made me jump. I didn't know if I was truly safe or if the mountain's influence extended beyond the mine itself. When I finally stumbled onto a logging road and was found by a pair of hunters, I was barely coherent. I was suffering from exposure, dehydration, and a level of shock the doctors would later say they had rarely seen. I told the authorities there had been a cave-in, that my partner, Ben, was killed. It was the only part of the truth I could give them. How could I explain the rest? The voices, the trapped souls, the thing made of shadow and rock. They would have locked me in a padded room for the rest of my life. They sent a recovery team to the Ironwood Creek mine. They found our destroyed campsite, just as I had described. They found the main entrance blocked by a massive, recent rock slide that their geological experts said was spontaneous and structurally baffling. They never found a way in. They never found Ben's body. The mountain had sealed its secrets and taken my friend as its price. The official report lists the cause of the incident as a localized seismic event, a freak of nature. I was given a long medical leave, and I never went back to geological surveying. I couldn't. I can't even stand to be in a basement anymore. The feeling of all that earth above me is suffocating. I moved to a city in the Midwest, a place as flat as a tabletop, as far from the mountains as I could get. I tried to forget. I tried to convince myself that what I experienced was a hallucination, a product of isolation and stress. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The story should end there. I survived. I got away. But the thing about an experience like that is that it never really leaves you. It becomes a part of you, a dark vein running through your memory. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind is blowing just right, I hear it. A faint, sibilant whisper just at the edge of my hearing. And that's not the worst part. About a month ago, I was in my apartment late at night. It was dead quiet, and I heard a voice, as clear as day, from the darkest corner of my room. It was that same calm, conversational voice from the mine. It only said 2 words. We wait. I live with my lights on now. I can't stand the dark, because the dark is never truly empty. I know that what's in that mountain is patient. It has been there for centuries, maybe millennia, collecting the souls of those foolish enough to trespass. It knows my name. It knows where I am, and it is waiting. So if you ever find yourself in a deep, dark place, and you hear a voice call out, I'm begging you, learn from our mistake. Do not, under any circumstances, answer. There are some silences that should never be broken, some doors that should never be opened. Remember the old rule they have up there in the Bitterroot Mountains, a rule I will carry with me to my grave. Never answer a voice that calls from the dark.